October, everybody! It's that glorious time of year where the weather cools, the leaves change color, pumpkin spice is back on the menu, and artists everywhere are doing monthly art challenges. Hi, it's me, I'm Artists. It's been a few years since I did a monthly art challenge, and I wanted to try one again this year. Specifically, OC Tober, drawing one of my original characters, or OCs, every day during the month of October. You guys were so jazzed about my randomized character video that I wanted to talk about some of my actual established characters, and I had big plans. I made a list of 31 of my OCs and planned to do an illustration for each of them, record the speed paint footage, then compile them all together into one big OC Tober video and talk about who they are and where they came from. But long story short, I got overwhelmed by how much work it was going to be and scrambled to make things a bit easier on myself. So here's what we're doing instead. I whittled down my list from 31 to about 20 characters, cutting out mostly D&D NPCs and characters that were sparse on details or less interesting to talk about, leaving only my most favoritist little guys. Plus, I'm leaving out the characters from my webcomic cast-off because if folks want to learn about them, you can just read the comic, link in the description. And to keep this video from being over an hour long, we're splitting it into 2 parts. This is part 1, part 2 will be out in a few weeks. While it's not really a 31-day art challenge anymore, I still just really wanted to talk about some of my original characters and share them with you guys, so that's what we're gonna be doing. But before we dive in, let's have a brief word from today's sponsor, Skillshare. You all know this, but I love drawing. Like, a lot. It's kind of my whole thing, really. But it's really easy to get lost in the weeds a bit and lose track of your fundamentals if you aren't going back to them frequently. I've definitely felt myself getting a bit out of practice recently. So to help shake myself out of that funk, I've been checking out a lot of different classes on Skillshare to help get back to the basics and learn some new stuff in the process. Skillshare is an online learning platform for creatives of all types to learn and discover creative passions. If there's something you want to learn about, Skillshare has you covered with hundreds of classes led by industry experts. Whether it's writing, drawing, design, animation, video editing, 3D modeling, if you want to learn something new, Skillshare's probably got a class for it. As I'm sure is obvious by the topic of the video, I really love coming up with characters, and in the spirit of getting back to basics and strengthening my fundamentals, I've been checking out some drawing and character design courses on Skillshare, including Character Design Crash Course, Dynamic Design, and 4 Steps. It's always good to go back to the basics occasionally, and I've been having a lot of fun checking out the classes on offer. Additionally, if you think you'd like to try making your own original characters, there's tons of classes that cover everything from character writing, drawing, design, anatomy, story structure, and more. Perfect for giving yourself a boost of creativity and challenging yourself to try new things. Since school's back in session, now's a great time to get started learning something new, and the first 500 people to use the link in the video description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Chase down your creative passions and try Skillshare today. Alright, let's get into talking about some little guys, shall we? While I wanted this list to mostly be in chronological order, it felt like it only made sense to start the video by talking about Star Carmine, my VTuber and internet persona. While this character is basically just a more visually exciting version of myself, I still really like her design and wanted to talk about her here. For a bit of background, I'm the type of person who, when playing video games with customizable player characters, almost always tries to make my character look at least vaguely similar to myself. It helps me feel like I'm the one becoming a Pokemon master, or whatever. So when I was designing my VTuber, I knew I wanted her to look somewhat similar to me. Brown hair, tall, greenish eyes that gradually morphed into yellow over the course of the design process. I made her color scheme mostly black and red with gold accents since those are my favorite colors to wear. I gave her a big bow because I used to wear big bows like this when I was a kid and I still think they're really cute. And I made her an elf because I'm a sucker for elves and pointy-eared characters in general. This is not news. I actually originally designed this character for an audition tape I sent to Hololive back in the day. I wasn't 100% satisfied with the design at that point, but I felt like I was definitely onto something here. And after a few months of tweaking and refining, I eventually came up with her final look. Since she's supposed to just be a representation of myself, I never really bothered giving her lore or anything, but later on I figured it would be fun to make her sort of a self-insert in my webcomic cast-off. You never actually see her in the comic, but she's totally following the cast around and documenting their various shenanigans the whole time and making a comic about it. It's silly, but I have fun over here. Oh, and since I've gotten questions about this in the past, let me go ahead and address this now. The reason she has a heart on her belt and not a star like everywhere else is because if I ever make this outfit in real life, a star-shaped belt buckle would stab me every time I bent over. I used to cosplay, and these are the types of things I think about when designing characters now. Anyway, here she is all done and dusted, what a cutie. From here on, we'll be going in roughly chronological order, and characters will also be grouped up by what project or series they're from. It's time to go back to middle school, y'all, because we're starting with Mari and Tara, some of my very first OCs. Not the absolute oldest, but definitely the first that really stuck around. I drew them as a pair here because, while they aren't canonically in a relationship or anything, it felt wrong to separate them. They're a bonded pair, do not separate them. These two were heavily inspired by me reading Azumanga in 6th grade, and Mari's hair is straight up just ripped from one of the characters in that series. They were very much intended to be a comedy duo. Tara was the incredibly energetic and hyperactive comedy instigator, while Mari was more of the snarky straight man type. Most of the punchlines of these comics revolved around Tara doing something silly or stupid, and Mari snarking at her for being silly and or stupid. I used these two for a lot of gag comic strips before eventually making them the main characters of my very first attempt at a longer comic story, a sci-fi fantasy series called Aurora Nova, which I'll talk about more in a bit. I actually did start trying to make it a webcomic, but I was literally just making up the script as I went and only got about 6 pages in before giving up. I still kept bouncing the ideas around in my head for a few years before eventually moving on to what would become my first real webcomic, Sai, and just for fun I ended up reusing Mari and Tara as side characters in that story. I've reused these two for a lot of different stories, and I think it just goes to show how much fun I have with them. Now, as for that old first webcomic, let's get a little deeper into that, shall we? My first epic fantasy sci-fi story I ever came up with was in late middle and early high school. The concept was that these two planets in a far-off galaxy were at war, and the smaller of the two planets, called Nova, had a prophecy that a chosen one from another galaxy would be the one to ultimately shift the tides of war. And in order to expedite the prophecy, the leader of Nova's special forces snuck onto a satellite owned by the evil planet, whose name I don't remember, and used their teleporter to try and summon the chosen one, but accidentally ended up summoning two, which is where Mari and Tara came in. And the leader of the special forces was none other than this guy, Haru. Haru was basically the tertiary main character alongside Mari and Tara. The idea was that he knew the two of them weren't the actual chosen ones mentioned by the prophecy, but since they weren't able to use the teleporter again to send Mari and Tara home, they decided to make do and train them as best they could. I don't remember much about his personality, except he was supposed to be really cool. Leader of the Nova Special Forces, despite being pretty young, he had spiky anime hair and ripped up clothes, and he also had this cool headband that was fabric when it was tied around his head, but when he took it off, it turned into a dragon he would fight alongside. Honestly, I still think that bit's pretty cool, and I even have this art of it from way back when. Fun concept, but very baby's first comic idea. Anyway, spoiler alert, the story ends with Mari and Tara still getting the Chosen One powers. The moral was supposed to be that anyone can save the world if they dedicate themselves to the task, and I thought that part of it was neat. There were a few other characters in this Aurora Nova story, including Haru's girlfriend/lieutenant, whose name I can't remember, and another character who was Tara's boyfriend, whose name was Arson? Yeah, I've mentioned this on stream a few times, but I legit named a random character Arson back in the day. He wasn't even an arsonist or anything. He was just a normal, perfectly pleasant dude. I just liked that word as a name for some reason. Again, baby's first big story idea. Try to be nice. Now, like I said, this story was my first webcomic in a way. But since it only got about 6 pages in, I don't think it really counts. My actual first webcomic, the first one that I really stuck with for a decently long time, was called Sai. Sai was a story I came up with during my last years of high school and started working on the day after my high school graduation. The basic premise was that people with psychic powers exist, but keep their powers hidden from the world at large. Sort of similar to the tried and true teens with magic powers go to secret special magic academy trope of kids in YA fiction. In this case, the special psychic school was basically an after-school program for psychic teens. There were 2 types of psychics: telekinetics, who could move inanimate objects, and psykinetics, who could read and control people's minds. There was also a secret 3rd type of psychic ability called biokinesis, which allowed users to manipulate the physical forms of living things. Biokinetics were so rare, there have basically only been a handful throughout history, including, our main character, May. May Honeycutt is the first biokinetic to exist in several centuries, and when she first figures out her powers, she's super excited, until she realizes that basically all past biokinetics have used their powers for evil, and now everyone expects that she'll do that too. Oh no! If I were to go back and take another crack at this story, I'd definitely do a lot of things differently. This was my first real stab at a longer form story, so there's a lot of weirdness in it I think is the sign of a novice writer. But I was having fun with it, and it helped teach me a lot about comics and writing, so I'm still glad it exists. May herself was kind of a boring main character in retrospect, but I do like her design and had fun drawing her. Her look was very heavily inspired by Yui from K-On!, except I gave her the little barrettes on both sides instead of just one. Original character design, do not steal. Looking back on it, she definitely feels like an early trial run version of Marina from Cast Off. Since her powers work on plants, she mostly uses them to grow stuff in her garden and accidentally make giant plant monsters, but she would have eventually figured out healing if the comic had gone on longer. While I never finished Sai, her endgame was that she would eventually become a doctor using her powers for healing purposes. A lot of unused stuff from May eventually transferred over into Marina once Sai was shelved. But of course, May wasn't the only character in the comic, so let's talk about some of the others. First up is our secondary main character, it's Lucas! Lucas is a telekinetic and also a childhood friend of May's. They're next door neighbors and spend a lot of time together, even attending the same after-school psychic classes. Lucas is an energetic and excitable character who tries very hard to be the cool guy and a superhero. He plays guitar and likes sports and uses his powers to cheat at dice games, but he's also a pillar of emotional support for May during the trials and tribulations of the series. Now, he did have a lot more personality and backstory to him we never got around to covering in the comic. His mother passed away in a car accident a few years prior to the story beginning, and that same accident left his father missing both legs. His father fell into a really intense depressive spiral afterwards and basically just refused to do much of anything, so Lucas's older sister stepped up and dropped out of college to get a job and support the family. Lucas himself was the middle child, and he was very much the type of character who had a lot going on in his home life but still tried to be chipper and supportive otherwise, which is a trait that very much carried over into Frankie and Cast Off later on. Are we seeing a trend here? One of the most memorable moments with Lucas was during the chapter where the main duo end up involved in a bank robbery, and Lucas decides to stop the bank robbery by running inside, getting shot at, and stopping the bullets with telekinesis, which was, in retrospect, horribly impractical, but also very cool when I was first writing it. Sometimes you just gotta surrender yourself to the flashy stuff, alright? So that's Lucas. Next up we have Xavier, the third main character to round out the main trio of Sai. Xavier is a few years older than the other two mains, a senior in high school compared to May and Lucas being freshmen. Xavier is a psychokinetic, meaning he can not only read people's minds, he can also speak to people with telepathic communication and even mind control people for a short amount of time. However, and this was a very fun aspect of his character, he mostly used his abilities to secretly assist with the school's drama club, helping actors remember their lines. I don't know, I thought that was a fun concept. As far as his personality goes, Xavier is a more calm and collected type of character. He doesn't show a lot of emotions and just kind of putters along doing his own thing most of the time. Since May is in his drama club as well as the same after-school psychic classes, he ends up being a bit of a mentor figure to her, keeping an eye out for her and being a bit protective. All of this is very much to the annoyance of Lucas, who thinks Xavier is too stoic for his own good, and maybe a large part of his hatred stems from jealousy, who knows? Don't let Lucas hear you say that though, he would not appreciate it. So, fun fact, some of you might be looking at this art and thinking, hey, this guy looks kind of familiar, what the heck? And I didn't even realize it until I was streaming while drawing these illustrations, but Xavier bears an almost uncanny resemblance to Sage from Cast Off. They both have black hair, wear glasses, have purple as their main color, and they even both have similar powers, and I didn't even notice until people in my chat started pointing it out. Turns out I only know how to make a few characters and steal from myself constantly, but to be fair to myself, their similarities are really only surface level and their personalities are extremely different. But I guess I just like nerds who wear purple sweaters. Now, just like May and Lucas are a very close pair, Xavier also has his partner in crime. So next up, let's talk about Millie, my beloved! Millie is the president of the school's drama club and is a very enthusiastic and driven director. She pushes hard on the members of the school's theater, and some members resent her for that, but they can all admit she definitely knows how to put on a good show. She and Xavier are basically a bonded pair of cats at this point. During their freshman year, Millie basically sidled up to Xavier and said, hey, you're cool, we're gonna be best friends now, wanna be in the drama club? And Xavier, being more nervous and shy back then, but still wanting friends, agreed. Another interesting aspect of their relationship is that Millie, despite not being a psychic herself, knows about the other characters and their powers because her younger sister is a telekinetic and attends the same psychic school classes as the other leading characters. Millie didn't get a lot of spotlight in the series, but she was definitely one of the most entertaining characters to write for. She's very dramatic and loves conversation and had a lot of fun little quips and quotes throughout the story. Definitely wish she had gotten more screen time in the comic, but what can you do? And finally, the last main character for the Sai portion of this video, Kai is an interesting guy. This dude definitely wanted to be the main character in a fantasy story, but instead he was stuck teaching a bunch of rowdy teen psychics. Looking back on it now, he really feels like a predecessor to Zara. Slightly older character with a traumatic backstory and depression who spends most of the narrative shrouded in mystery. In Kai's case, he's a rare type of psychic who has both telekinetic and psychokinetic abilities. It made him uniquely qualified to be a teacher, but having both powers means they actually cancel each other out, so he's significantly weaker than most of his students. His tragic backstory involves him being from a small fictional country that in the olden times was victim to a biokinetics I'm gonna take over the world rampage, and as a result, their entire culture is vehemently anti-psychic. Kai was told since birth he could never show his psychic abilities to anyone, but on the day of his wedding used telekinesis to save his wife-to-be from being crushed by a falling pillar or something. She was grateful he saved her, of course, but Kai himself ended up banished from his community as a result and has been an outcast ever since. And the scar on his nose came from a wound he sustained while he was being chased out. Yay, tragic backstory! There were some more details in his backstory, but it was kinda silly looking back on it. There's a lot about Sai I would change or remove entirely if I went back and took another stab at it, and Kai cheating his way into medical school specifically to develop a cure for a plague by himself at age 19 is definitely one of those. Oh, the playground of young ideas. While I had a lot of fun working on Sai, and it definitely helped teach me a lot about making comics, I ultimately ran out of steam for it around the end of college and shelved it permanently not long after graduating. And then a few years later I started Cast Off. Again, we won't be talking about the cast-off characters here, but the epilogue to Kai's story is that I recycled him and gave him a cameo in a later chapter of Cast-Off. He's an elf now, because I said so. Also, this character standing next to him is his fiancée from his backstory. I forgot her name, but she's pretty. They found each other in another life and actually get to be together this time. Yay! But now they have entirely different problems. Not yay! Anyway, that's all I have for Sai, so let's move on to our last few little guys for this first half, shall we? Our next character is sort of a weird transitional character. This is Nia. She was originally used for a character project I did with some friends, but once I wasn't involved in the project anymore, I took her and developed her some more on my own time. The original idea is that she's a storyteller and an archivist of sorts with the power to physically enter the story of any book she finds. Her name actually relates to this. Nia is short for Polymnia, one of the Greek muses, and her last name is Grimm, which of course is a reference to Grimm's fairy tales. I had an idea for a mini-comic featuring her where she'd find a book that had been mostly destroyed in a fire and went into the story to help figure out how the story ended so she could restore the book. But then, in the process, she meets all the characters in the story, acting like a pseudo-therapist for each of them, and in the end helps rewrite the story to have a happier ending. It was a cute idea that never fully materialized, and once I gave up on that idea, I ended up recycling her into a minor NPC in the D&D game I run for friends. In our D&D universe, she's a necromancer who's only in it for the historical research aspects. She goes into old tombs and gets first-hand historical accounts by using Speak with Dead on the buried corpses of soldiers and citizens of past civilizations. Did I mention that she's a huge nerd? Because she is very much a huge nerd. I do have a lot of other NPCs from the game I've been running for a few years, but like I said at the start, I cut them out for this video. I think that maybe someday I'll do a video talking about that campaign, and that feels like a better place to go into detail on all the characters I came up with for that story. But it was around this point in time I started getting into D&D and other tabletop games. So for our last character for part 1, let's talk about the first TTRPG campaign I ever joined. Although I'm a big fan of D&D and fantasy in general, my first time being included in a longer TTRPG campaign was actually more of an urban fantasy. Or I guess you could say a rural fantasy. For a few years, my friends and I played a game called Monster of the Week, a game that's very much based on the Monster of the Week style mystery shows like Scooby-Doo or The X-Files. If you listen to The Adventure Zone, this is the same game they used for the Amnesty arc of the show. Our story in particular was about a group of monster hunters in a backwater rural Texas town, and my character was Thalia, a rowdy teen and aspiring punk rock musician who dropped out of the preppy college her rich parents forced her to attend, and now works as a DJ at the club the Monster Hunter organization is based out of. She was arguably the most chaotic of the bunch, at least in terms of personality. Ironically, she was also the most normal. Her character class was called the Mundane. In a game where almost all other classes are magical or supernatural in some kind of way, the Mundane class basically gives you perks and special abilities based on just being a normal human who got wrapped up in some nonsense. Which definitely fits my girl here. In a world of monsters and supernatural entities, she was a snarky teen making mischief and causing chaos. One of her most notable shenanigans was unintentionally becoming known as the San Nuez Banksy, leaving weird graffiti all over town. It was mostly dicks, if I'm being honest. She and Jester from Critical Role would have gotten along famously. Later on in the campaign, she actually got some magic of her own when she touched a ghost and it gave her superpowers, namely the ability to do some minor water control effects. Her primary method of using these powers was to carry around water bottles that she would throw at people and detonate like little steam bombs. Unfortunately, this game ended up never finishing, as COVID and a lot of scheduling conflicts sort of killed our drive for it. But I still had a lot of fun playing Thalia and really enjoyed the time we spent in this campaign. Somewhere out there, Thalia is still causing mayhem, drawing dicks on pigeons and rocking out at the club. So that's where we're going to stop for part 1. Like I said, part 2 will be coming out in a few weeks and we'll cover a bunch of my more recent characters, so be on the lookout for that. But before we go, it's time for Star's Webcomic Corner, the part of the video where I recommend some of my favorite comics, boost my fellow creators, and give you guys something new and fun to read. So let's get into it. Bounty hunting is a dangerous business. Constantly hopping from planet to planet, risking life and limb to track down your quarry, dealing with a range of criminals from petty thieves to mass murderers, all for an unstable paycheck so you might be able to afford repairs to your rickety old ship. It's not a job for the faint of heart. Someone's gotta do it. Ghost Junk Sickness is the story of Trigger and Vaughn, a pair of bounty hunters struggling to make ends meet. When their unsteady routine is suddenly shaken up by the appearance of a dangerous and unpredictable bounty known only as the Ghost, mysterious connections begin piling up and dragging them closer and closer to the eye of the storm. But what awaits at the center of all this chaos? Ghost Junk Sickness is a story that's been in my list for a while, and although I'm still working my way through the archive at the time of writing this promo, I'm already hooked just from the parts I've read. And considering I'm not usually a sci-fi person, that's saying something. There's a lot of moving parts in this comic, and the story does a good job of really hooking you in. The characters are complex and compelling, the story is well crafted and intriguing, and the art is gorgeous, with a mix of color and black and white pages, each with stunning visuals and action-packed fight scenes that make it a real treat for the eyes. If you like comics with a big archive, this one will keep you busy for a while. With 22 chapters in the books and the story nearing completion, it's a great one to sink your teeth into and binge read over several sittings. And if you like what you see, you can even snag the full collection of physical books on Kickstarter. When this video goes up, there will only be a few days left in the campaign, but if you enjoy physical books, this will be a nice set to get your hands on. If you like what you see, you can read the entirety of Ghost Junk Sickness for free on the website, so go check it out, and I hope you all enjoy. All right, it's time to wrap up, but one final announcement before we go. I'm working on a new video for later this year, and I need your input. If you have seen my randomized character writing video, I'll be taking another stab at that challenge, but this time, instead of being randomized, I'm letting you all help me decide the designs and character aspects for each character. I've linked a Google form down in the description with all the info, so if you want to be included in some audience participation, be sure to check that out. Thanks as always for watching, and a special thank you to my Patreon supporters who help make these videos possible. Along with all the super cool folks scrolling along on the left, I'd like to give a special thank you to my video shout-out tier patrons, Jared, Holly, and Mr. Don Matsu. Thank you for enabling me to yell about my little DIY blorbos for an entire video. If you'd like to join them and get a bunch of cool bonuses like early access to videos, comic pages, and behind-the-scenes materials, plus a ton more, you can head to patreon.com/castoff, link is down in the description. And that just about does it for this one. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. Bye!